I'm Madeline Rhodes, and the only reason my name matters tonight is because my father tried to break me in front of 200 people. Yet the moment he raised his glass to call my life a mistake, Colton slipped a slim envelope into my hand as if the real story had just begun. I remember him murmuring that Denver would change everything while the laughter around us rang a little too eager, as if they believed the verdict had already been written. I kept my fingers on that envelope until the guests were gone, feeling the weight of something sharp and deliberate sealed inside it. I opened it alone, expecting an apology or maybe a plea to leave the chaos behind. But instead, a single badge brushed my palm with its gold foil letters marking VIP access to the Denver Tech Summit, as if I were meant to stand in a room I had never been invited to before. Colton watched my confusion settle and told me I needed to see the kind of world my father believed he controlled. A world where truth didn't hide behind last names or fortune. I asked what any of this had to do with the man who dismissed him as a mechanic. And he only answered that timing mattered more than explanations. I wanted to press him, to demand why a badge from the most exclusive tech conference in the Rockies sat in my hand on the very night my father humiliated us. But Colton simply touched my wrist and murmured that some revelations require altitude. There was no tremor in his voice when he added that Denver would show me the part of his life he had kept quiet. Not out of deceit, but out of caution. The steadiness of that moment unsettled me more than the insult my father had thrown hours earlier. I stood in our quiet living room, replaying the toast that should have shattered us and the strange calm Colton carried through it, as if he had already seen how the next move unfolded. He whispered that Gregory had been chasing a $60 million contract with a company that rarely stepped into the spotlight. And the irony of that chase would make sense soon. All I knew as I closed my hand around the badge was that the man my father mocked had just handed me the one key that felt less like a gift and more like the start of a reckoning waiting in the cold air of Denver. I knew the fall had begun when my banking app froze on a gray loading screen, and the clerk's voice tightened while explaining that every card tied to Gregory Rhodes had been revoked. And all I could hear was my father's warning echoing through the line that independence always came with a bill I couldn't afford. Linda called before I even stepped out of the building, smoothing her breath around a suggestion that I could come home if I ended the marriage, adding that a family like ours couldn't survive the optics of my choices. Bradford's post went up an hour later with a smirk tucked into the caption about watching someone trade legacy for love, as if my life were a punchline waiting for applause. I walked into my office at the branding firm the next morning, hoping the weekend chaos hadn't followed me. But the hush that spread through the hallway told me exactly how far my father's reach could stretch. My supervisor pretended to straighten a stack of papers while murmuring that the company needed distance from anything tied to Rhodes Energy. And I caught the tremor in her voice when she added that it was out of her hands. The HR manager met me at my desk with an apology wrapped around the instruction that I should avoid client-facing work until the leadership team reassessed my role. I packed my things quietly, listening to colleagues speak in careful tones about how careers depend on neutral ground. And one of them tried to soften the moment by mentioning that public tension between a parent and child can destabilize partnerships more than anyone expects. Messages from friends trickled in throughout the day, full of lines about obligations and timing. And one of them insisted she couldn't be photographed with me until everything settled because her father had contracts in negotiation. By dusk, the invitations that once filled my phone were replaced by silence. And the sudden emptiness told its own story without needing a narrator. Gregory called just as the sun dropped behind the Houston skyline, letting the dial ring long enough to make his control feel intentional before his voice arrived with the measured cadence of someone closing a deal. He asked if I understood what severing myself from the family truly meant, then followed it with a cool reminder that the Rhodes name had shielded me longer than I realized. I listened without responding, aware that every sentence was designed to make me step back into a life that had never belonged to me. Linda left a final message that night with a trembling insistence that love couldn't replace structure. And she urged me to think clearly before destroying what she called my foundation. Bradford sent a screenshot of a headline predicting instability at Rhodes Energy. adding that I shouldn't make things harder for the family by feeding the rumors. I lay awake after their voices faded, holding the Denver badge in my hand and realizing that for the first time in my life, the world pulling away from me was quieter than the world pulling me forward. I moved to Phoenix with the kind of resolve that grows when every bridge behind you has already burned. And Colton welcomed me into a modest apartment with the quiet assurance that starting over wasn't a punishment, but a doorway I hadn't asked for yet. He placed a roll of bills on the counter while mentioning that rent was covered for the month. And the ease in his voice wrapped oddly around the thought that a garage owner shouldn't carry that much cash unless there was more to his life than he let on. I unpacked boxes that first night while telling him I needed space to rebuild my career. And he nodded with a steadiness that made the air feel heavier than the conversation deserved. I spent mornings sending proposals to small businesses, offering brand strategy at rates low enough to get someone to answer. And the silence that followed my emails layered itself into a rhythm I tried to ignore. Colton returned from the garage each evening smelling faintly of engine heat. Yet his phone kept lighting up with messages asking for updates on deliverables that sounded nothing like automotive work, prompting me to murmur that his job seemed more complicated than he admitted. He brushed a thumb across his screen before mentioning that every career has its backstage. Though the glance he tried to hide pulled at a thread I couldn't stop following. I woke one night to a thin beam of light under the living room door and found Colton murmuring about algorithmic stability and lab readiness. And the terms rolled through the dark with a precision that didn't match wrenches or oil pans. He noticed me standing there and offered a soft line about late-night problem-solving. But the tension in his shoulders tightened when I asked why a mechanic needed data reports. I returned to bed with the uneasy sense that he was living in two worlds, and I had only met one of them. The next afternoon, Diana Whitford called with the kind of controlled urgency that makes your spine lock before the words arrive. And she explained that my grandmother had left a trust worth $400,000 that activated solely because I married outside the list Gregory once insisted on. I sat very still as Diana detailed the clause meant to protect the first real choice I ever made. And the weight of my grandmother's faith pressed deeper than the number attached to it. When Diana mentioned a handwritten note waiting for me at her office, the ache in my chest tightened into something close to gratitude. I told Colton about the trust that evening while reviewing my growing list of freelance inquiries. And he touched my shoulder gently while murmuring that I finally had breathing room to build something that belonged only to me. His calm steadiness should have comforted me. Yet the lingering memory of his late-night call made the moment rest unevenly between reassurance and suspicion. I tried to focus on the small victory unfolding in front of me. But the truth was I couldn't shake the sense that Colton's life held more variables than he allowed me to see. I lay awake again that night, staring at the Denver badge beside my pillow while replaying the contradictions I kept stumbling over. From the cash he carried to the terms he used so fluently in the dark. He slipped an arm around me with a quiet line about how storms reveal more than still days ever do. And the warmth of his voice settled against the doubt rising under my ribs. I closed my eyes while holding the badge in my hand, aware that my new beginning had already braided itself with questions I would have to face long before Denver offered its answers. I noticed the shift the morning Colton set 2 mugs on the table and mentioned that keeping parts of his life quiet wasn't secrecy but timing. And the calm in his voice tightened something in me as I asked what kind of work required midnight calls about algorithms and facilities in Colorado. He rested his hands on the back of a chair while offering that living with a man meant eventually seeing the architecture of the world he moved through. Then added that the pieces would make sense in Denver because the summit wasn't just an event but a doorway I needed to walk through without fear. I watched him study me with a steadiness that felt deliberate. And when I murmured that a mechanic shouldn't understand quantum terminology so fluently, the corner of his mouth lifted in a way that made my pulse jump before he told me the garage had never been the whole story. I wanted to push harder. Yet my breath caught when he reached into the drawer and placed a second envelope beside the badge, explaining that the summit listed him as a guest of honor and that seeing it written would spare me the shock later. My fingers hesitated above the seal, until he added that every truth he owed me would land in one sweep. Then he brushed my wrist with the quiet reminder that trust grows in the moments when explanations aren't ready yet. I broke the seal to find an invitation edged in metallic ink, naming him as a featured speaker. And the floor seemed to tilt as I asked what exactly he was preparing me to witness. He stepped closer with the kind of soft intensity that leaves no room for evasion and told me that people judge a life by labels. But labels were the last thing he cared about when he met me in Phoenix. I whispered that I needed the truth without riddles. And he breathed the words that his work sat beneath a company larger than my father's entire portfolio, though only a handful of people knew his role in it. The words unsettled me not because they were grand, but because they were spoken with the ease of someone who had carried them too long. I stared at the Denver badge lying between us and asked why he chose to live behind the comfort of a garage when another world clearly waited for him. He traced a slow line across my palm while offering that a man learns the value of love only when it cannot be bought. And he needed to know that my choice wasn't shaped by the empire he built in silence. I felt the truth rising before he spoke it fully. Yet when he murmured that Denver would reveal everything my father had miscalculated, the room felt smaller than the future pressing toward us. I walked into the Denver Tech Summit with the awareness that every step carried me closer to a truth Colton had promised would land all at once. And the hum of executives around us sharpened when Gregory's voice cut through the crowd with a cold question about whether I planned to embarrass him again. I kept my gaze steady while telling him I wasn't here for him, and his eyes narrowed as he muttered that a daughter who chose a mechanic over a dynasty shouldn't expect to stand in a room built for innovators. Colton angled slightly in front of me with a quiet line about how innovation often comes from places men like Gregory refuse to look. And the spark in my father's stare told me the insult had hit deeper than intended. Gregory turned his full attention on Colton with a clipped remark about wasted potential, then added that Reeves Quantum Systems needed someone with real discipline if they hoped to finalize the $60 million contract Rhodes Energy had graciously entertained. My breath caught as Colton's hand brushed my back before he murmured that the summit wasn't the place for theatrics. Though Gregory leaned in with a threat, wrapped in the claim that a man without pedigree should show gratitude when powerful families tolerate him, I watched the tension settle in Colton's shoulders as he murmured that clarity was coming sooner than Gregory expected. And the certainty in his tone made the world around us tighten into a single point of anticipation. The lights dimmed as the host stepped onto the stage to introduce the panel, and the murmurs in the room shifted when she announced the featured speaker as the co-founder and chairman of Reeves Quantum Systems, whose work in quantum architecture had reshaped the national landscape. I felt Gregory stiffen beside me. But nothing prepared him for the moment. The name Colton Reeves rolled across the speaker system, and the screen behind the stage lit up with the portrait of the man he had mocked as a garage worker. Silence cracked through the hall as Colton walked forward with the composure of someone stepping into the life he had built piece by piece. And I realized the truth he'd carried in the dark now stood in full view of the world that once dismissed him. He opened his remarks with a line about how every breakthrough begins with a refusal to underestimate people. And the audience's applause washed through the room while Gregory's breath faltered beside me. He spoke about integrity shaping the architecture of trust in the quantum space, then shifted effortlessly into the revelation that his company partnered only with organizations whose leadership demonstrated respect at the human level before the corporate one. I watched him glance toward the crowd with a subtle nod in our direction as he added that he valued partners who upheld their own families before demanding loyalty from others. And the ripple in the audience confirmed they understood the message as clearly as Gregory did. When the panel ended, Gregory pushed through the crowd to reach us with a strained line about discussing the contract privately. But Colton met him with a steady voice, reminding him that business requires alignment. Neither money nor legacy can manufacture. Gregory insisted that family disagreements shouldn't jeopardize a partnership of this scale. And his tone slipped toward desperation as he muttered that his daughter had always been too emotional to understand the weight of decisions like these. Colton stepped closer, lowering his voice into the quiet assertion that men who tear down their own blood don't earn the right to speak of discipline or vision. Then added that Reeves Quantum would never sign with a leader who weaponizes control as a substitute for character. Bradford and Linda appeared behind Gregory with tentative expressions. And Linda pleaded that we could revisit the conversation once emotions cooled. But I met her gaze with the calm that arrives only after breaking free. I told them that the divide between us wasn't born in Denver, but in every moment they chose image over truth. And Bradford flinched when I added that the road's name had never been a shield for me. Only a leash. The crowd parted as Colton slipped his hand into mine with a line about heading toward a future that didn't require permission. And I let the noise of the summit fade behind us while Gregory's stunned silence followed like a shadow no longer capable of catching up. We stepped out into the crisp Denver air as the city hummed below the mountains. And Colton murmured that transparency has a gravity of its own once it's spoken aloud. Then asked if I was ready for the life that waited now that the truth stood unmasked. I told him that choosing him had never been about pedigree, but about the calm he carried even when the world tried to fracture mine. And he responded with a quiet relief that made the moment settle deeper than triumph. As we walked away from the summit, I knew that the reckoning Denver delivered wasn't just my father's, but mine too. Because the woman stepping into that street no longer needed legacy to define the horizon she chose. I built my small branding studio in Phoenix with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. And when Colton walked in after locking up the garage to murmur that building something from nothing suited me more than any legacy ever had, I realized the quiet of this new life finally felt like mine. Gregory reached out through distant messages asking if peace was possible. Yet the soft resolve in my chest grew each time. I told myself that forgiveness didn't require returning to the walls that once held me. I spent evenings beside Colton while he reviewed data for projects I now understood with clearer eyes. And the rhythm of our days settled into something honest enough to stand without explanation. Diana handed me my grandmother's letter during a stop at her office. And I traced the uneven edges, while her voice echoed through the memory of that clause meant to free the first choice I made without fear. Colton brushed a curl behind my ear that night while offering that the trust wasn't a rescue but a reminder that beginnings don't need permission. And the warmth of his words folded into the certainty growing inside me. I saw Phoenix differently as weeks passed. Noticing how the sun hit the windows of our apartment and how the quiet allowed me to breathe in ways Houston never had. When Denver faded into the rear view of our lives, the tension lifted with it. And Colton murmured that truth loses its weight once it stands in daylight. Asking if I was ready to let the past drift where it belonged, I leaned into him with the quiet certainty that love grounded in honesty builds a steadier future than any empire. And he held me with the relief of someone who no longer carried two worlds alone. The path ahead felt wider than anything I imagined when my life first splintered. And for the first time, the horizon wasn't a warning but an invitation. Thank you for staying with me through this story. And if any part of my journey reminds you of your own search for peace or the strength to choose a life that finally fits, I'd love to have you here for the next chapter. So feel free to leave a thought below and subscribe if you'd like to walk with me a little longer.